Good evening all, and welcome back to FEAR NOX. Tonight we idle beneath a mountain where road becomes room and water draws lines on black stone. These 10 verified accounts come from night crews, highway watch, hikers, and scanner pulls gathered near a single-lane bore that keeps one red lamp burning. Mountain rain slicks the entry, tires lift fine mist, and voices carry farther than light. You'll hear a horn answer from deeper than the wall, a flashlight bloom with no hand behind it, and a test echo return with an extra breath. Some threats wear reflective gear and wave a fake work truck through the dark. Others live in falling seep, black ice near the mouth, and rock that shifts when thaw returns. Subscribe to FEAR NOX for weekly documentary-style true horror stories that blur the line between evidence and nightmare. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let's roll into the tunnel where distance starts to listen back.
My shift as dockmaster starts well before the first light, typically around 0400 hours. I've been overseeing this stretch of commercial waterway and its associated facilities for 15 years now. My responsibilities cover everything from coordinating cargo movements to managing the fuel float and ensuring secure access to the service docks. This includes maintaining the integrity of the main service gate, which is the only landside entry point for authorized personnel and salvage operations. My standard equipment includes a handheld radio, a secure tablet for manifest and contract verification, and a set of binoculars for distant vessel identification. The bay here is tidal, with a typical 6-foot swing, and keeping track of the ebb and flow is as critical as any security protocol. Every vessel, every crew, every piece of equipment that comes through that service gate has to be on file. It's non-negotiable. We're dealing with commercial operations, sometimes sensitive cargo, and always environmental regulations. A vessel needs a valid registry, and any crew performing work on our property, especially salvage, requires a pre-approved contract number. This number is logged into our central database, accessible via the phone tree system, and cross-referenced with the company's insurance and operational permits. It's a robust system, designed to prevent unauthorized access, ensure accountability, and mitigate liability. It's the backbone of our operation. The morning of the incident was clear, unusually calm for late autumn. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of diesel and drying seaweed, not the usual sharp tang of a coming front. I just finished my initial rounds, checking the mooring lines on the larger tugs, and was back in the dock office, logging the overnight temperatures. The tide was dropping, nearing its lowest point for the morning cycle, which meant any vessel needing to clear a shallow channel would be waiting for the turn. Around 0630, my gate camera feed flickered. 2 figures stood at the service gate. This was unusual. Typically, crews call ahead on the marine band radio or use the intercom. These 2 were just standing there, looking directly into the camera. They were dressed in new-looking, bright orange bib overalls, the kind that still hold their factory creases. One of them held up a piece of plywood. On it, a neat black stencil read, "Oceanic Salvage and Recovery." I picked up the intercom. "This is the dockmaster. Can I help you?" The voice that came back was flat, uninflected. "Access requested. Salvage operation. Tide dropping." "Do you have a contract number for Oceanic Salvage and Recovery?" I asked, already tapping into the phone tree on my tablet. "No number," the voice replied. "We're new. Just started. We have the Stencil." He gestured vaguely at the plywood. This was the first breach of procedure. No contract number, no entry. It was that simple. I informed them of the policy. I need a contract number on file. If you don't have one, I can't grant access. We need to get to the skiff, the second voice chimed in, equally devoid of inflection. Tide's dropping, losing time. I glanced at the tide chart on my desk. They were right, it was still going out, but they weren't in any immediate danger. The pressure they were trying to exert felt artificial. I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt for a moment, thinking perhaps a new company hadn't fully integrated into our system yet. This was my mistake. I should have ended the interaction there. Instead, I asked, "What vessel are you operating? What's its registry?" "Skiff," the first one said. "Small, gray, no registry. Just the skiff." No registry, no contract. This was moving from unusual to unacceptable. I told them to wait, that I needed to make some calls. I tried the phone tree again, searching for oceanic salvage or any variation. Nothing. I tried calling the general number for the Regional Salvage Authority. No record of a new company with that name. I even tried a quick search on my personal phone for local business registrations. Again, nothing. It was like they didn't exist. I walked down to the gate, my heavy boots crunching on the gravel. The air was still, but the silence felt heavier now. The two men stood perfectly still, watching me approach. Their bibs were too clean, almost sterile, contrasting sharply with the weathered dock pilings and the salt-stained concrete. There was no mud, no grease, no chafe marks, the usual hallmarks of working on the water. "Look," I said, reaching the gate, keeping a respectful distance. "I can't let you in without a contract number and a registered vessel. It's a liability issue." The man holding the plywood lowered it slightly but kept it facing me. The stencil was indeed neat, almost too perfect, as if it had been made moments before. "The skiff is at the fuel float," he said. "We need to get to it, to fuel, then out." This caught me off guard. The fuel float was inside the secure perimeter, past the service gate. "How did you get a skiff to the fuel float if you don't have access?" I asked, a knot tightening in my stomach. My protocol for securing the fuel float was stringent. Only authorized vessels were allowed to moor there overnight. They didn't answer directly. The second man just pointed a gloved hand toward the water, past the gate, towards the fuel float. I squinted, using my binoculars. And there it was. A small gray skiff, tied to the end of the fuel float. It was low in the water, and its hull was indeed devoid of any visible registration numbers. It looked old, battered, yet somehow also anonymous. There was no name painted on its stern, no home port. Just a dull gray hull, like a ghost. I felt a chill despite the calm morning. How had it gotten there? I distinctly remembered checking the float at 0500. There had been no skiff. My memory of that check was clear. I'd even noticed a seagull perched on the furthest fuel pump. This was a procedural paradox. The skiff could not have been there, unless I had missed it. But I never missed a vessel. A small, mundane memory flashed into my mind. Years ago, my first year as dockmaster, I'd forgotten to log a fishing trawler's departure. My supervisor had given me an earful, and I'd never made that mistake again. This was different. This wasn't a mistake. This was an impossibility. I immediately called my supervisor on the radio. "Unauthorized vessel at the fuel float. 2 individuals at the service gate requesting access. No contract, no registry. Claiming salvage." The supervisor's voice crackled back. "Did you check the security feed?" Not yet for the float, I admitted, my focus having been on the gate. I'm at the gate now. Get back to the office. Review the footage from 0400 onwards. Do not engage further. Do not grant access. I'm calling the harbor patrol. I backed away slowly from the gate, keeping my eyes on the two men. They remained still, watching me, their faces shadowed by the brims of their caps. As I turned to head back to the office, the man with the plywood spoke again, his voice still flat. Tide's turning soon. We'll be back. Back in the office, my hands felt clumsy on the keyboard. I pulled up the security feed for the fuel float, rewinding it to 0400. The feed was clear. I watched myself conducting my rounds. No skiff. I watched for another hour. Still no skiff. Then, at precisely 0527, a flicker, a momentary pixelation across the screen, less than a second. When the image stabilized, the gray skiff was there, tied to the float, as if it had simply materialized. There was no approach, no wake, no figures on board. Just there. I played it back, frame by frame. The flicker was too brief, too clean to be a typical camera glitch. It was like a cut. I tried to zoom in on the skiff, but the resolution blurred. I called the supervisor back, my voice tighter than before. The skiff wasn't there at 0500. It appeared on the feed at 0527. There's a gap, or something. Appeared? The supervisor asked, his voice now sharp with concern. I'm sending patrol. Keep the gate locked. Do not approach the float. I looked out the office window. The two men were gone from the gate. I scanned the water, towards the fuel float. The gray skiff was still there, now riding slightly higher as the tide began its slow turn. Its engine coughed once, a low, guttural sound that carried clearly across the still water. Then it went silent again. I watched, my hand hovering over the radio for a long time. The skiff remained, an impossible object, waiting. My shift as harbor watch began like any other, the air thick with the scent of brine and diesel from the distant trawlers, a familiar comfort after 15 years on this coast. The signal hut, perched on the landward end of the main breakwater, was my world for the next 8 hours. Inside, the low hum of the radar console was a constant companion, alongside the crackle of the VHF radio. My tools were simple but vital. The radar scope, the sonar display, the weather station readouts, and the logbook, a heavy ledger where every vessel movement, every weather change, every unusual observation was recorded with meticulous precision. This stretch of the North Atlantic coast, particularly around the harbor entrance, demanded vigilance. The breakwater itself, a colossal arm of rock and concrete, shielded the inner harbor from the relentless ocean swell. Beyond its head, a line of navigational buoys marked the deep water channel, each fitted with a bell or a horn, their signals designed to cut through the frequent fog. My primary duty was traffic management, identifying vessels, confirming their intentions, and guiding them safely through the channel. The core protocol was absolute. Any vessel approaching the breakwater head from the open sea must register on radar, must establish VHF contact, and must provide a clear destination. It was the bedrock of maritime safety. The night was unusually calm. A low fog had rolled in just after sunset, turning the distant harbor lights into blurred halos. Visibility was down to a quarter mile, perhaps less. The radar was my eyes. I just logged a departing fishing trawler, Sea Serpent, at 22:17, its blip slowly fading towards the horizon. The scope was clear, a serene expanse of green, save for the static of rain squalls further offshore. I leaned back, sipping lukewarm coffee, the only sound the rhythmic sweep of the radar arm. Then, it came. A horn, not the sharp, mechanical blast of a commercial freighter, nor the deeper, mournful groan of a foghorn on a distant lighthouse. This was different. A rolling, resonant sound, deep and full, as if it had traveled through water before reaching the air. It felt close, too close for a vessel outside the channel. My eyes snapped to the radar. Blank. Nothing. I frowned, leaning forward, my hand instinctively reaching for the gain knob. Perhaps the fog was playing tricks, or a momentary power fluctuation. I ran a quick diagnostic on the console. All systems nominal. I increased the gain, then reduced it, sweeping the range. Still nothing. The scope remained a pristine, empty green. A flock of gulls, roosting on the flats beyond the breakwater, erupted in a cacophony of squawks, scattering into the fog. Their sudden flight, usually only triggered by a loud nearby disturbance, confirmed the horn wasn't a trick of my ears. I checked the log, confirmed the last vessel was well clear. No inbound traffic was scheduled. Unidentified vessel, this is Harbor Watch. I spoke into the VHF microphone, my voice betraying none of the sudden unease tightening in my gut. State your position and intentions. Over. Only static answered, punctuated by the faint, distant clang of the channel buoys, their bells stirred by the lazy swells. I waited, scanning the radar again, my gaze fixed on the area just beyond the breakwater head. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the hut windows. Then the horn sounded again. This time, it felt closer, more distinct, almost under the water. A deep vibration that seemed to resonate through the very concrete of the breakwater. And then, impossibly, the buoy bell, the one marking the outer edge of the channel, rang out. Not a continuous jingle from passing waves, but two distinct, deliberate clangs. Clang, clang. Like a response. Like a word. My breath hitched. Buoy bells don't... I knew the channel buoys intimately. Their specific tones, their positions. This was the outermost one, buoy Alpha 3. I tried the VHF again, my voice firmer this time. Unidentified vessel, you are in the approach channel. Identify yourself immediately. Over. Silence. The only sound was the low thrum of the hut's ventilation and the distant, rhythmic slosh of the tide against the rocks. I checked the sonar, nothing but the usual subsurface clutter. The indistinct echoes of the seabed and the occasional school of fish. No large, solid object. My training screamed at me. If it's not on radar, it's not there. But the horn, the gulls, the deliberate clang-clang of the buoy bell, they were undeniably real. This was the first professional protocol that failed me. Reporting an anomaly that had no physical signature. How do you log a ghost ship? I made a quick, decisive entry in the logbook. 2238, auditory contact, unknown source. No radar sonar signature. Attempted VHF contact, no response. Buoy A3 observed ringing anomalously. It felt insufficient, a lie by omission. A cold dread began to seep in. I had a momentary lapse, a flicker of overconfidence perhaps, when I dismissed the first horn as a possible distant echo from a vessel well outside my jurisdiction. Now it was directly challenging my instruments, my training, my understanding of the harbor. I considered calling the supervisor, but what would I say? I hear a horn, but nothing's there, and a buoy bell is talking back. It sounded like a breakdown, not an incident report. My protocol for unidentified vessels was clear: visual confirmation if radar failed. But in this fog, venturing out was risky, and leaving the hut unattended violated another standing order. Still, the radar was useless. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my emergency radio, securing the hut door behind me. The air outside was colder, damp, tasting of salt and something else, a faint metallic tang I began the walk along the breakwater, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow tunnel through the swirling fog. The concrete underfoot was slick with sea spray. I remembered a time, years ago, fishing for striped bass off this very breakwater with my grandfather. The air had been clear, the sun warm on my face, the only sounds, the real clicking and the gentle lapping of waves. The contrast was stark, a sudden, unwelcome memory. As I neared the breakwater head, the sounds intensified. The rhythmic swish, slosh of the sea against the rocks seemed to carry a deeper vibration now, a low hum that I felt more than heard, resonating through the thick concrete. Subsurface resonance, perhaps? But from what? I reached the head, the wind picking up slightly, whipping the fog around me. I shone my light out towards the buoy line. The buoys were barely visible, indistinct shapes in the gloom. Buoy Alpha 3, the one that had answered, was a dark silhouette, its bell silent for now. Then the horn sounded again, closer than ever. It wasn't just rolling, it felt enveloping. It vibrated in my chest, in the very ground beneath my feet. And this time, it felt like it was coming from below me, from the water directly off the breakwater head. And then buoy Alpha 3 rang. Not twice, but a frantic, rapid sequence of clangs, as if struck repeatedly by an unseen force. Clang, 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 clang. The sound was sharp, desperate, echoing unnaturally in the fog. The gulls, which had settled back down, shot into the air again, circling wildly above the unseen flats. Their cries, shrill and panicked. I swept my flashlight beam across the water, but there was nothing. No wake, no vessel silhouette, no disturbance on the surface beyond the normal swell. Just the churning, dark water, reflecting my beam back into the fog. But the vibration was undeniable. My shift as harbor watch began like any other, the air thick with the scent of brine and diesel from the distant trawlers, a familiar comfort after 15 years on this coast. The signal hut, perched on the landward end of the main breakwater, was my world for the next 8 hours. Inside, the low hum of the radar console was a constant companion, alongside the crackle of the VHF radio. My tools were simple but vital: the radar scope, the sonar display, the weather station readouts, and the logbook, a heavy ledger where every vessel movement, every weather change, every unusual observation was recorded with meticulous precision. This stretch of the North Atlantic coast, particularly around the harbor entrance, demanded vigilance. The breakwater itself, a colossal arm of rock and concrete, shielded the inner harbor from the relentless ocean swell. Beyond its head, a line of navigational buoys marked the deep water channel, each fitted with a bell or a horn, their signals designed to cut through the frequent fog. My primary duty was traffic management, identifying vessels, confirming their intentions, and guiding them safely through the channel. The core protocol was absolute. Any vessel approaching the breakwater head from the open sea must register on radar, must establish VHF contact, and must provide a clear destination. It was the bedrock of maritime safety. The night was unusually calm. A low fog had rolled in just after sunset, turning the distant harbor lights into blurred halos. Visibility was down to a quarter mile, perhaps less. The radar was my eyes. I just logged a departing fishing trawler, Sea Serpent, at 22:17, its blip slowly fading towards the horizon. The scope was clear, a serene expanse of green, save for the static of rain squalls further offshore. I leaned back, sipping lukewarm coffee, the only sound the rhythmic sweep of the radar arm. Then it came. A horn, not the sharp, mechanical blast of a commercial freighter, nor the deeper, mournful groan of a foghorn on a distant lighthouse. This was different. A rolling, resonant sound, deep and full, as if it had traveled through water before reaching the air. It felt close, too close for a vessel outside the channel. My eyes snapped to the radar. Blank. Nothing. I frowned, leaning forward, my hand instinctively reaching for the gain knob. Perhaps the fog was playing tricks, or a momentary power fluctuation. I ran a quick diagnostic on the console. All systems nominal. I increased the gain, then reduced it, sweeping the range. Still nothing. The scope remained a pristine, empty green. A flock of gulls, roosting on the flats beyond the breakwater, erupted in a cacophony of squawks, scattering into the fog. Their sudden flight, usually only triggered by a loud nearby disturbance, confirmed the horn wasn't a trick of my ears. I checked the log, confirmed the last vessel was well clear. No inbound traffic was scheduled. Unidentified vessel, this is Harbor Watch. I spoke into the VHF microphone, my voice betraying none of the sudden unease tightening in my gut. State your position and intentions. Over. Only static answered, punctuated by the faint, distant clang of the channel buoys, their bells stirred by the lazy swells. I waited, scanning the radar again, my gaze fixed on the area just beyond the breakwater head. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the hut windows. Then the horn sounded again. This time, it felt closer, more distinct, almost under the water. A deep vibration that seemed to resonate through the very concrete of the breakwater. And then, impossibly, the buoy bell, the one marking the outer edge of the channel, rang out. Not a continuous jingle from passing waves, but two distinct, deliberate clangs. Clang, clang. Like a response. Like a word. My breath hitched. Buoy bells don't... I knew the channel buoys intimately. Their specific tones, their positions. This was the outermost one, buoy Alpha 3. I tried the VHF again, my voice firmer this time. Unidentified vessel, you are in the approach channel. Identify yourself immediately. Over. Silence. The only sound was the low thrum of the hut's ventilation and the distant, rhythmic slosh of the tide against the rocks. I checked the sonar, nothing but the usual subsurface clutter, the indistinct echoes of the seabed and the occasional school of fish. No large, solid object. My training screamed at me. If it's not on radar, it's not there. But the horn, the gulls, the deliberate clang-clang of the buoy bell, they were undeniably real. This was the first professional protocol that failed me. Reporting an anomaly that had no physical signature. How do you log a ghost ship? I made a quick, decisive entry in the logbook. 2238, auditory contact, unknown source, no radar sonar signature, attempted VHF contact, no response. Buoy A3 observed ringing anomalously. It felt insufficient, a lie by omission. A cold dread began to seep in. I had a momentary lapse, a flicker of overconfidence perhaps, when I dismissed the first horn as a possible distant echo from a vessel well outside my jurisdiction. Now it was directly challenging my instruments, my training, my understanding of the harbor. I considered calling the supervisor, but what would I say? I hear a horn, but nothing's there, and a buoy bell is talking back. It sounded like a breakdown, not an incident report. My protocol for unidentified vessels was clear: visual confirmation if radar failed. But in this fog, venturing out was risky, and leaving the hut unattended violated another standing order. Still, the radar was useless. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and my emergency radio, securing the hut door behind me. The air outside was colder, damp, tasting of salt and something else, a faint metallic tang I began the walk along the breakwater, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow tunnel through the swirling fog. The concrete underfoot was slick with sea spray. I remembered a time, years ago, fishing for striped bass off this very breakwater with my grandfather. The air had been clear, the sun warm on my face, the only sounds, the real clicking and the gentle lapping of waves. The contrast was stark, a sudden, unwelcome memory. As I neared the breakwater head, the sounds intensified. The rhythmic swish, slosh of the sea against the rocks seemed to carry a deeper vibration now, a low hum that I felt more than heard, resonating through the thick concrete. Subsurface resonance, perhaps? But from what? I reached the head, the wind picking up slightly, whipping the fog around me. I shone my light out towards the buoy line. The buoys were barely visible, indistinct shapes in the gloom. Buoy Alpha 3, the one that had answered, was a dark silhouette, its bell silent for now. Then the horn sounded again, closer than ever. It wasn't just rolling, it felt enveloping. It vibrated in my chest, in the very ground beneath my feet. And this time it felt like it was coming from below me, from the water directly off the breakwater head. And then Buoy Alpha 3 rang. Not twice, but a frantic, rapid sequence of clangs, as if struck repeatedly by an unseen force. Clang, 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 clang. The sound was sharp, desperate,
echoing unnaturally in the fog. The gulls, which had settled back down, shot into the air again, circling wildly above the unseen flats. Their cries, shrill and panicked. I swept my flashlight beam across the water, but there was nothing. No wake, no vessel silhouette, no disturbance on the surface beyond the normal swell. Just the churning, dark water, reflecting my beam back into the fog. But the vibration was undeniable. I've been a rigging lead for 22 years, mostly on offshore support vessels working the Gulf of Mexico. It's a job of precision, patience, and absolute trust in your gear. Every lift, every deployment, every recovery, it's all about the numbers. Load cell readings, line tension, drum turns, hydraulic pressure. You learn the sounds of a vessel too. The hum of the engines, the slap of waves against the hull, the whine of a gearbox under strain. They become a kind of language, telling you if everything's running true or if trouble's brewing. This particular night we were recovering a subsea module, a heavy piece of equipment from about 1,000 feet down. It was a standard operation, one we'd done countless times. Seas were calm, barely a ripple, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt. I was stationed at the aft winch, overseeing the recovery. My job was to monitor the process, communicate with the bridge and the winch operator, and ensure every step of the lift protocol was followed. The aft winch was a powerful beast, a massive drum wrapped in thick steel wire, driven by a hydraulic motor and a complex set of gears housed under a heavy steel guard. The core protocol, the one that saved lives and millions in equipment over the decades, is simple. Trust your instruments, but verify with your senses. If the load cell says 50 tons, but the wire is groaning like it's about to snap, you stop. If the pressure gauge reads steady but the motor is chugging, you stop. The machine speaks, and you listen. We were about halfway through the recovery, the module still deep below the surface. The winch was working hard, the wire steadily spooling in. The load cell read a consistent 48.5 tons, well within the safe working load. The hydraulic pressure was stable. The winch operator, a seasoned hand, had the controls dialed in for a smooth, slow ascent. That's when I first heard it. A sound, distinct from the usual mechanical symphony. The drum took a steady strain, and the gears beneath their guard began their deep, resonant thrum. But woven into that thrum, almost like a breath escaping the mechanism, was a soft, sibilant whisper. It was indistinct at first, like the wind catching a loose piece of canvas or the distant call of a gannet. I chalked it up to fatigue. We'd been on this rotation for 3 weeks, and the night shifts were starting to blur. I rubbed my eyes, checked the load cell again. Still steady. The winch operator was focused on his display, oblivious. The sound came again, a little clearer this time. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't a bird. It was too close, too internal to the machine. It was a vocalization, a faint, drawn-out syllable, like a sigh that had formed into a word. It seemed to feather the air directly from the area of the gear guard. I leaned closer, placing a hand on the cool, vibrating steel of the guard. The vibration was normal, a deep rumble. My ear was inches from the metal, trying to isolate the sound. Then it came again, a clear, unmistakable phonetic pattern. It wasn't a full word, not really, but the shape of a name, a woman's name. It was whispered, soft, almost mournful, but undeniably there, resonating from within the heavy machinery. The sound was too specific to be pareidolia, too repetitive to be a trick of the wind. I froze, my hand still pressed against the gear guard,
feeling the steady thrum that now seemed to carry this impossible whisper. "Hear anything?" I asked the winch operator, trying to keep my voice casual. He glanced over, eyebrows raised. "Just the usual. Why?" "Nothing," I said, pulling my hand away. "Just thought I heard something over the engine noise." He shrugged and went back to his controls. He hadn't heard it, or if he had, he'd dismissed it, just as I had initially tried to do. But for me, the sound had become too insistent. I walked around the winch, inspecting the hydraulic lines, the motor housing, the main drum bearings. Everything looked tight, clean, well lubricated. The smell of hot hydraulic fluid was strong in the air, a familiar, comforting scent that usually meant everything was working as it should. Tonight, it just felt heavy. I remembered a time, years ago, when I was just starting out. I was on a small fishing boat, and the old captain used to say the boat had a soul, that it would talk to you if you listened close enough. I'd always dismissed it as seafaring superstition, the ramblings of lonely men. Now, standing on the deck of a multi-million-dollar vessel, listening to a precision-engineered machine whisper, that old memory felt less like folklore and more like prophecy. The module was slowly ascending, the wire glistening as it emerged from the water, shedding seawater in sparkling sheets under the deck lights. The load cell remained steady, unwavering. The winch continued its powerful, rhythmic operation. And with every rotation of the drum, every cycle of the gears, the whisper came again. It wasn't loud, never loud, but it was persistent. A breathy, drawn-out sound that formed the same name. It felt like the machine was exhaling it, a soft, sorrowful release of air. I checked the maintenance logs on my tablet. The winch had been serviced 3 weeks prior. Full inspection. No anomalies. All bearings, gears, and hydraulic systems were green. There was no mechanical reason for this sound. My protocol, the one that relied on physical evidence and instrument readings, was failing me. How do you log "winch whispers a name" in a maintenance report? As the module broke the surface, water cascading off its frame, the winch strained for a final, crucial moment. The load cell briefly spiked by a fraction of a ton as the water resistance broke, then settled. In that exact instant, as the module cleared the waves and hung suspended, dripping, above the deck, the whisper came again, clearer than ever. It was a single, drawn-out syllable, undeniably a woman's name, echoing directly from the gear guard. It was so clear, so precise, that it felt like it had been spoken right into my ear. I flinched, stepping back from the winch. The winch operator, for the first time, looked up sharply. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low, a tremor in it I hadn't heard before. "Hear what?" I asked, feigning ignorance, my heart pounding. He shook his head slowly, eyes wide. "Nothing, just a funny sound, like a sigh." The module was secured, the recovery complete. The winch idled down, its mechanical breathing slowing, quieting. The whisper ceased. The deck lights hummed, the engines droned, and the sea slapped softly against the hull. Everything was back to normal. I filled out the recovery report. Operation normal, no mechanical issues. It was technically true. The load cell hadn't lied, the winch had performed flawlessly. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the night air, that the machine had spoken. And it had spoken a name that wasn't meant for me to hear. The winch sits silent now, waiting for the next deployment. I still walk past it, checking the lines, the drum. Sometimes in the quiet hours, I think I can still hear the faint, lingering echo of that impossible whisper, waiting for the gears to turn, for the breath to come again. I've been a systems tech for offshore installations for 18 years. My work primarily involves the maintenance and troubleshooting of navigation aids, remote monitoring cameras, and communication arrays on platforms and vessels operating in the North Pacific. It's a job that demands precision and a strict adherence to protocol, because a single system failure can have catastrophic consequences. We rely on data, on verifiable readings, on the empirical evidence our instruments provide. My toolkit is full of meters, analyzers, and specialized diagnostic software, all designed to confirm that what we see on a screen is what's actually happening out there in the elements. Last Tuesday night, I was on the graveyard shift, 00 to 080, running routine checks on platform 17. The wind had picked up around 0300, gusting to 40 knots, and the platform was creaking like an old ship. My station in the control room was warm, humming with the low thrum of the servers. I was cycling through the visual feeds, checking the masthead beacon. It's a critical piece of equipment, a powerful white light that flashes every 5 seconds, visible for miles. Its operational status is monitored by multiple redundant systems, including a dedicated PTZ dome camera mounted at the main deck level, directly below the mast. The core protocol for any navigation aid is absolute operational certainty. If a beacon is powered on, it must be emitting light. If it's emitting light, that light must be physically observable and measurable. The dome cam, designated Cam 03, feeds directly into the main control console, providing real-time visual verification. It's a high-resolution unit, capable of picking up a seagull at 100 yards in a squall. Around 0317, during my sweep, I brought up Cam 03. The masthead beacon, perched atop the mainmast, flared into view. It was impossibly bright on the monitor, a searing white pulse that bloomed across the screen every 5 seconds, momentarily washing out the surrounding darkness. It was brighter than I'd ever seen it, almost overexposed. My first thought was simple fatigue. I'd been up since yesterday morning, and the flickering light was making my eyes swim. I rubbed them, then looked again, still blinding. I checked the system logs for Cam 03. No alerts, no warnings. Power draw was nominal. Operating parameters were all green. My initial assumption, a common one in low-light camera work, was that the camera's automatic gain control had cranked itself to maximum sensitivity, perhaps due to the ambient darkness, and the beacon being the only significant light source. A gain ghost, we call it. A digital artifact where the camera exaggerates a light source. It's an annoying but usually harmless phenomenon. I made a mental note to adjust the gain settings manually after I finished the full system sweep. My mistake was not addressing it immediately, dismissing it as a known technical quirk rather than an active anomaly. I finished the sweep, logging everything as normal, then returned to Cam 03. The beacon still pulsed with that unnatural intensity. I accessed the camera's manual controls and tried to reduce the gain. No change. I adjusted the exposure, decreasing it incrementally. The beacon remained a blinding white bloom. The surrounding darkness on the screen, however, began to deepen, becoming an inky black void. The deck below the mast, the railing, the stanchions, they were all just silhouettes devoid of any reflected light from the beacon. This was unusual. A light that bright, even at night, should cast some illumination, some spill, onto the immediate surroundings. But on the monitor, the light was contained, almost surgically precise in its brightness, as if it existed only within its own digital parameters. I switched to Cam 04, a wide-angle deck camera positioned further aft, offering a broader view of the mast and the forward deck. On Cam 04, the masthead beacon appeared as a distinct, sharp point of light, not the overwhelming bloom of Cam 03. But again, the deck lay in deep shadow. There was no visible throw of light, no illumination spilling onto the forward bulkheads, no glint on the wet steel of the deck plates. It was as if the beacon's light was a flat, two-dimensional image projected onto the camera lens, without any physical depth or spread. The air in the control room felt suddenly colder, despite the steady hum of the HVAC. I could smell the faint metallic tang of ozone from the server racks, a detail I rarely noticed. This wasn't a gain ghost. If the camera was merely overexposed, the light would bleed, creating a halo effect, and any surface it hit would reflect. This light simply was. It was bright on screen, but it didn't interact with its environment. The protocol for a navigation aid that appears to be operating, but isn't physically illuminating, is non-existent. Our manuals cover power failures, lamp failures, rotation motor failures, even signal interference. But not this. I decided a physical inspection was necessary. It was 3:45. I grabbed my flashlight and my hard hat, pulling on my heavy weather gear. Stepping out onto the main deck, the wind immediately hit me, a cold, damp slap to the face. The platform groaned around me, a symphony of stressed metal and rushing water. The rain had started, a fine, stinging spray carried horizontally by the wind. I could hear the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull far below. I made my way forward, toward the mast. The deck was slick, and I kept one hand on the cold, vibrating rail stanchion. My flashlight beam cut a path through the driving rain, illuminating the wet steel. I looked up at the masthead. The beacon was there, a dark cylinder against the storm-swept sky. I watched it for a full minute, my neck craning, rain running down my face. It was dim, barely a flicker. Certainly not the blinding, searing pulse I'd just seen on the monitor. It was a pale, anemic glow, struggling against the darkness, barely visible through the rain and wind. The deck around me remained black, save for the narrow beam of my flashlight. There was no light from the beacon reaching me, no illumination on the forward deck. Nothing. I remembered a summer evening as a kid, camping by the coast, watching the beam of a real lighthouse sweep across the dark water, painting the distant trees with light for a brief, reassuring moment. This was nothing like that. This was a dark, functional object doing nothing. Back in the control room, shivering despite the warmth, I pulled up Cam 03 again. The beacon flared, brilliant and uncompromising on the monitor. I toggled to Cam 04. Again, a sharp, intense point of light. I cross-referenced with the physical observation log. My own entry from moments ago stated, masthead beacon, dim, intermittent flicker, no visible light throw on deck. Yet the system reported 100% operational status. Full power draw, perfect timing. I initiated a diagnostic cycle on the beacon itself. The system ran through its checks, reporting optimal performance.
The light on the screen continued to pulse, bright and unwavering. It was a perfect, digital light, utterly detached from the physical world. The problem wasn't a faulty camera or a gang ghost. The camera was faithfully reporting what it saw, but what it saw was not what was physically there. The beacon was dark to my eyes, yet it blazed on the screen. A beacon of pure data, casting no shadows, illuminating nothing but the pixels of a monitor. I logged the anomaly as visual discrepancy unresolved, knowing it wouldn't make sense to anyone reading it. The light on the screen continued its silent, powerful pulse. A phantom glow in a dark, indifferent world.
I've been a yard hand for over 20 years, working the docks and slips of this stretch of the Pacific Northwest coast. My certifications cover everything from heavy lift operation to hazardous materials, but mostly, it's about understanding the water. Tides, currents, wind shear, they're as predictable as the sun setting, if you know how to read them. My shift starts before dawn, usually with the smell of salt and diesel hanging heavy in the cool air, and the groan of pilings working against the ebb. This particular morning the tide was running out hard, pulling a steady 6-knot current through the main channel. Inside the inner slip, where the smaller skiffs and workboats berth, the flow was less aggressive, maybe 2 knots, but still a noticeable tug. My routine is etched deep. Check mooring lines, inspect fenders, log any discrepancies. Safety first, always. A loose line can turn into a damaged hull in a matter of hours, especially with a strong tide. I carry a heavy-duty flashlight, a multi-tool, and a small logbook. That logbook is my Bible. Every observation, every knot retied, every anomaly, gets noted with a timestamp. I was working my way down the main catwalk, heading towards the furthest mooring posts. The air was still, the kind of pre-dawn quiet where you can hear the water lapping against the hull planks. My breath plumed white in the chill. As I approached the last section, a familiar sight caught my eye. The old diesel skiff, Puffin, as its faded letters read, tied up to a solid timber post. It was a common sight. A working boat, nothing special. Except, something was off. The skiff was eased against the current, not just holding its own, but positioned as if it were actively pushing into the flow. My eye immediately went to its mooring lines. 2 lines, bow and stern, secured to the post, then led to cleats on the skiff. Both were slack. Completely slack. They hung in gentle arcs, barely touching the water. If the boat were holding against a 2-knot current, those lines should have been taut, humming with tension. My first thought was a reverse eddy pocket. They form sometimes in the inner slip, especially when the tide rips through the main channel and hits the breakwater at a specific angle. It creates a small, localized swirl of water that can push upstream. It's rare for one to be strong enough to hold a skiff like this, but not impossible. I'd logged a few over the years. I even remember one time, years ago, when a small dinghy got caught in one for an hour, spinning slowly against the main current. I made a mental note to check the tide charts again later, just to confirm the conditions for an eddy. That was my mistake. My initial overconfidence in an easy explanation. Then I saw the smoke. A plume of diesel exhaust, thick and bluish, was rising from the skiff's stern. It wasn't dissipating normally. Instead, it moved a few feet against the faint breeze coming off the water, then just hung there. A dense, unmoving cloud, defying the gentle air currents and the strong ebbing tide. Diesel smoke, like everything else, follows the path of least resistance. It disperses. It moves with the wind. This smoke was an immobile anchor in the air, a physical impossibility. I stopped dead on the catwalk. The cold metal railing felt slick under my gloved hand. The smell of the diesel exhaust, usually a familiar, almost comforting scent in the early mornings, now felt acrid, unnatural. My logbook remained closed. This wasn't a simple line check. I walked closer, my heavy boots thudding softly on the planking. The skiff was maybe 10 feet from the catwalk. The water around its hull was disturbed, a faint ripple pattern suggesting movement. But the boat itself appeared stationary relative to the current. Yet, the lines remained slack. I could have reached out and plucked one. No engine noise, no vibration from the hull. The skiff was silent. The exhaust, however, continued to bloom from the stern, forming that impossible, unmoving cloud. My protocol for an unattended vessel with an engine running is clear. Immediate investigation, attempt to shut down the engine, and contact the owner or harbor master. But this wasn't an engine running. It was an engine exhausting, without any other sign of life. I leaned over the railing, trying to get a better look at the stern. The skiff was maybe a foot and a half below the catwalk. The exhaust pipe, just above the waterline, was steadily expelling the blue-gray smoke. It was a continuous output, not a sputtering. But the skiff wasn't vibrating. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. Its beam cut through the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the water directly under the stern. There was no propeller wash, no telltale churn of water that would indicate an engine engaged in reverse, holding against the current. Nothing. I decided I needed to get onto the skiff. My plan was to carefully step onto the deck, check the engine compartment, and if necessary, cut the fuel supply. This was beyond an eddy pocket. This was a violation of basic physics. I looked at the slack bow line, then the slack stern line. They were perfectly intact. No fraying, no signs of stress. As I took a step onto the mooring post, intending to use it as a bridge to the skiff, I noticed something else. The skiff, tied to the post with slack lines, was ever so subtly moving upstream. Not just holding its position, but inching forward, against the current, with the lines still slack. It was like watching a ghost tugging on a leash that offered no resistance. The boat was pulling itself forward, but the lines weren't tightening. It was impossible. The boat was moving, but the mooring post wasn't. The lines were connected, but not taut. I paused, my foot still on the timber post. The air grew colder. Or maybe it was just me. I remembered a summer day, years ago, fishing with my father in the Puget Sound. The sun warm on my face, the gentle rocking of the boat, the predictable tug of the current against the anchor line. Everything made sense then. The water behaved as it should. I tried to radio the supervisor, pulling my handheld from my belt. Yard 1 to supervisor, come in. Static. Nothing. The radio had been working fine 5 minutes ago. I tried again. More static. My professional protocol, to report any unusual vessel behavior immediately, was now failing. The skiff continued its impossible drift. The slack lines barely quivered. The diesel smoke, a solid, unmoving column, now seemed to coalesce into a dense cloud directly above the stern. A solid, smoky cap defying gravity and air currents. It was a physical presence, not a gas. The skiff was pulling itself upstream, the lines still slack, the mooring post fixed. The boat was moving, but the lines were not taut. It was as if the very space between the skiff and the post was stretching. Yet the lines themselves weren't. I stood there, one foot on the mooring post, the other on the catwalk, suspended between my training and an undeniable, horrifying reality. The skiff, the smoke, the slack lines, the upstream movement. It was a contradiction that broke every rule I knew about the water, about physics, about the world itself. I pulled out my logbook, but what could I write? Skiff moving upstream, lines slack. Smoke defying physics? It sounded like delirium. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the inner slip. The impossible skiff continued its slow, silent journey against the current, tethered by nothing, exhaling its unmoving breath into the morning air. I just watched it, and I logged nothing. There was nothing to log that made sense. I've been the maintenance lead for this port facility for 17 years. Before that, I spent a decade on the docks, learning the systems from the ground up. My experience covers everything from heavy equipment operation to structural integrity checks on the pilings. We operate year-round, which means dealing with every kind of weather the North Atlantic can throw at us. Winter is always the most challenging. Ice is a constant threat, and our protocols for detecting and mitigating it are exhaustive. Lives depend on them. Every morning, before the first shift of longshoremen arrives, I conduct a full inspection of all critical access points. This includes gangways, catwalks, and especially the pier ladders that drop down to the water level for vessel access or emergency egress. My standard kit includes a handheld anemometer, a digital thermometer, and a moisture meter. I log readings at 20-minute intervals for 2 hours, starting at 4 o'clock, then again at 6 o'clock before the main shift. This particular morning, the weather report had called for clear skies, ambient temperatures hovering just above freezing, around 34 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze from the northwest. Conditions were dry. My initial 400 readings confirmed this. Air temp 34.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Relative humidity 68%. No precipitation. The deck was dry, showing no residual moisture from the previous day. Our core protocol, established after a near-miss incident involving a slippery gangway in '08, is simple. Any access point showing signs of moisture at or below 35 degrees Fahrenheit is immediately treated with industrial-grade de-icer and cordoned off until safe. If ice is detected, the area is shut down. No exceptions. This rule is drilled into everyone. It's the bedrock of our winter safety. I've personally applied hundreds of pounds of de-icer over the years, often in the pitch black of pre-dawn, ensuring those rungs and treads are clear. This morning, as I approached Ladder Point Charlie, the main access ladder to the lower pier and small craft moorings, I noted the deck was completely dry. My boots crunched softly on the frost-free concrete. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar, slightly metallic tang of salt spray off the water, a smell that usually meant a clear, cold day. I'd walked this stretch 1,000 times. I glanced at the ladder. It looked fine, the steel dark and unblemished by frost. The ambient temperature was holding steady at 34.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Confident in the visual and the readings, I reached for the first rung. My right boot, a heavy-duty work boot with aggressive tread, found the rung. My left foot followed, stepping onto the second. That's when it happened. Not a slip, but a sudden, violent slide. My weight shifted, and the world tilted. My hands, gloved, gripped the cold steel, but there was no purchase. My body pitched forward, a sickening lurch into empty air. For a split second, I was falling. Time seemed to stretch. I heard the frantic scrape of my boots against the rungs, a sound that drilled through the calm morning. My mind registered the dark water below, the jagged pilings. Pure, animal panic. Then, with a jarring impact, my left boot caught. It snagged on the last rung, the one just above the waterline, stopping my descent with brutal force. My right leg dangled, my hands white-knuckled on the steel. The breath was knocked out of me. I hung there, suspended, heart hammering against my ribs. The cold steel bit into my palms. Slowly, carefully, I pulled myself back up, one rung at a time, until my feet were firmly on the deck. I stood, shaking, trying to process what had just occurred. My knee throbbed where it had slammed against the steel frame. I looked down at the ladder. It was covered in a thin, perfectly clear sheet of ice. Black ice. Not frosted, not opaque, but utterly transparent, making the dark steel beneath it look completely dry. The deck around the ladder was still bone dry. My thermometer, placed directly on the ladder's surface, read 28.1 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 degrees colder than the ambient air. This was a direct violation of protocol, a failure that nearly cost me dearly. The rule was clear: any moisture at or below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. But there was no visible moisture. It was a phantom hazard. I immediately called in the incident, reporting a Category 2 ice hazard, localized and transparent. Dispatch acknowledged, and I began the process of cordoning off the area. I retrieved a bucket of industrial de-icer from the nearby bin. The granules, a mixture of magnesium chloride and calcium chloride, were designed to work down to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. I started at the top, carefully spreading the de-icer over each rung. The ice hissed and melted, forming rivulets of dark water that dripped into the harbor. Within minutes, the ladder was clear. I rechecked the surface temperature, 31.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Still below ambient. I made a note in the log, time-stamping the application. Then I waited. Standard procedure dictated a 20-minute observation period. I pulled out my logbook, noting the details of the fall, the readings, the de-icer application. My hands still trembled slightly. I thought about the simple pleasure of my morning coffee, hot and sweet, just an hour before. A small comfort in the cold pre-dawn. It felt 1,000,000 miles away from the sharp terror of that fall. At the 15-minute mark, I noticed it. A faint sheen, almost imperceptible, beginning to form on the middle rungs. It wasn't frost. It was that same clear, glassy surface. I touched it. Cold. Slick. The surface thermometer, which I'd left clipped to the ladder, slowly ticked down. 30.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Then 30.5 degrees Fahrenheit. The ambient air was still 34.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice was reforming, not from precipitation, not from condensation that froze, but from some localized internal cold. It was as if the ladder itself was radiating cold, pulling moisture directly out of the air and freezing it onto its surface, despite the air temperature being above freezing. I applied a second, heavier dose of de-icer. Again, the ice melted. Again, the ladder cleared. But the unnerving feeling persisted. This wasn't how ice behaved. I checked the other pier ladders, both within 50 yards. They were completely dry, their surface temperatures matching the ambient air. Only Ladder Point Charlie was affected. I called dispatch again. The ice is reforming, despite de-icer. It's localized to the ladder itself. Surface temps are consistently below ambient, even after treatment. Understood, dispatch replied, their voice calm but with an edge of concern. Keep the area secured. We'll send a structural engineer to investigate. Do not attempt further access. I secured the ladder with heavy-duty chain and bright yellow hazard tape, effectively abandoning the primary access protocol for that specific point. It was the first time in my career I'd had to do that without a clear, explainable cause. The engineer arrived an hour later, a young woman with a thermal camera. Her readings confirmed mine. A distinct, localized cold spot on the ladder. A thermal anomaly that defied the ambient conditions. The ladder's steel seemed to be acting as a heat sink, but to an extreme degree, and only in that specific location. We found no structural damage, no unusual metal composition, nothing to explain the phenomenon. For the next week, we monitored Ladder Point Charlie. Every morning, despite dry conditions and above freezing air temperatures, the ladder would be coated in that insidious black ice. We continued to de-ice, but it was a losing battle. The ice would melt, then slowly, silently, reform. It was like watching a wound heal, only this was cold, not flesh. And it was a healing of something that shouldn't be there. The engineers eventually installed a localized heating element, a temporary measure, but the phenomenon remained unexplained. The logs show a consistent discrepancy. Air temperature always above 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Ladder surface temperature always below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still there, a constant, unnerving presence on the pier. A steel ladder that generates its own cold. A silent testament to a morning where luck, not procedure, saved me from the harbor's dark embrace. I've been a marine signal operator for 12 years, working the coastal repeater network that blankets this stretch of the Pacific Northwest. My station, nestled into a bluff overlooking the Sound, is a small insulated room. A radio bay filled with the hum of electronics. VHF consoles, HF transceivers, a bank of monitors displaying vessel traffic, and the constant low thrum of the digital logging system that records every whisper and shout across the airwaves. It's a job of routine, of listening, of maintaining the invisible lines that guide ships through fog and storm. The air here always carries a faint scent of ozone and stale coffee, a familiar comfort. My primary responsibility is Channel 16, the international hailing and distress frequency. Every vessel, from a fishing skiff to a container ship, is required to monitor it. Every transmission begins with a call sign, a unique identifier that links the voice to a registered vessel in our database. It's the bedrock of marine communication, ensuring clear identification and accountability. Without it, the system collapses into chaos. My console logs every transmission, time-stamping it, cross-referencing the call sign, and storing the audio. It's a foolproof system, or so I believed. It was a quiet Tuesday night, well past midnight. The weather was calm, a low mist clinging to the water, but no active advisories. Just the usual chatter. A tug reporting its position, a ferry requesting a berth update, the distant murmur of international traffic on the long-range channels. I was halfway through my shift, mind numbly processing the data stream, when the voice cut through the background static on channel 16. Coastal Control, this is pilot boat Orion, requesting clear channel for inbound transit to the harbor approach. I blinked. My hand paused over the log entry. Orion. The name hit me with a jolt of recognition. The pilot boat Orion had been decommissioned in 2018, stripped of its navigation equipment, sold for scrap, towed south. It hadn't plied these waters in 6 years. My first thought was a prank, or perhaps an old, unregistered vessel using a familiar call sign. I briefly considered if it had been recommissioned under the same name, a momentary lapse in my usual strict adherence to protocol, a tiny mental shortcut born of fatigue. I quickly brought up the vessel database on my secondary monitor, typed in Orion. The entry flashed, Pilot Boat Orion, IMO 8765432. Status: decommissioned. 2018 0714. No ambiguity. No active registration. Unidentified vessel claiming call sign Orion. This is Coastal Control. Please identify yourself. Your call sign is not registered as active. I transmitted, my voice flat, professional. Only static answered. The channel returned to its low hum. I logged the incident as unidentified transmission, possibly spurious or prank. It was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes old equipment bleeds over, or a bored amateur radio enthusiast tries to stir things up. But the voice, it had a particular cadence, a slight gravelly quality. It felt familiar. I pulled up the archive search function, went back to 2017, the Orion's last full year of operation. It took a few minutes to filter through the routine traffic, but I found a transmission from late October that year. A routine inbound transit request, almost identical to the one I'd just heard. I played it. The sound filled the radio bay. The same gravelly voice, the same measured pace, the same faint background hum. I played the new recording directly after the old one. Then I layered them, syncing the start. It wasn't just similar. It was identical. Every inflection, every pause, the precise rhythm of the words, even the subtle hiss of the radio. This wasn't bleed over. I immediately called the supervisor. They were initially skeptical, probably some cross-channel interference or an old recording cycling back through. We've seen stranger things. They ordered a full system diagnostic run on all repeaters and the main console. While the diagnostics ran, the Orion called again, 3 hours later. Pilot boat Orion, requesting clear channel for inbound transit. Same voice, same message. This time, a freighter, the Sea Serpent, responded. Coastal Control, did you just hear that? Orion? I thought that boat was gone. The anomaly was no longer contained to my console. My supervisor listened to the recording, the identical voice, the freighter's confused query. The diagnostic came back clean. All systems fully operational. No anomalies. No interference. The protocol of clear vessel identification, the very foundation of our work, was failing. The supervisor, now visibly uneasy, decided we needed to physically check the repeater mast closest to the triangulated origin of the Orion's signal. It was a remote site, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking a particularly treacherous stretch of water, not far from the old pilot station that had been abandoned decades ago. I volunteered to go with the technician. The drive was long, the gravel road winding through dense coastal forest. The air was damp and smelled of pine and salt. I remembered as a child listening to my grandfather's old shortwave radio, tuning through the static, imagining voices from distant lands. It was a simple, innocent curiosity then, a stark contrast to the precise, regulated world I inhabited now. At the mast site, the technician methodically checked the antenna, the amplifiers, the power supply. Everything was in perfect order. While he worked, I wandered over to the derelict pilot station, a crumbling wooden structure slowly being reclaimed by the elements. A long shot, I knew, but sometimes old answers lie in old places. Inside, dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the boarded-up windows. A shelf, half collapsed, held a stack of water-damaged logbooks. Most were illegible, but one, bound in stiff canvas, was from 2017. I carefully opened it. Flipping through the brittle pages, I found the entry for October 2017. Pilot Boat Orion, inbound transit, 2317 UTC. The exact date and time of the archived audio clip that perfectly mirrored the phantom transmission. The physical log, the digital log, the voice. They all converged on an impossible point. Back in the radio bay, the Orion called again. But this time, the message was different. The voice, still the same, was strained, urgent. Coastal Control. Coastal Control. This is Pilot Boat Orion. Taking on water. Engine room breach. Requesting immediate assistance. Position. Bearing 270 from buoy 6. Approximately 3.5 nautical miles. My blood ran cold. The position given was a notorious wreck site, a shallow rocky reef. It was where the Orion, after its decommissioning, during its tow to the breakers, had broken free in a sudden squall and foundered. The skeleton crew on the tow vessel had barely escaped. The boat itself was lost, swallowed by the waves. The ghost ship was calling from its own grave. The protocol for a distress call is immediate, unequivocal response. Every available asset. But how do you respond to a vessel that doesn't exist, calling for help from its watery tomb, with a voice from its past? The supervisor standing beside me heard it all. After a moment of stunned silence, their voice was tight. Do not acknowledge. Do not log as active distress. It's a ghost signal. The primary protocol, the most sacred rule of the sea, was abandoned. The Orion's distress call repeated several more times over the next few hours, each transmission growing fainter, more garbled, until it was just static and a faint, mournful whisper. The channel has been silent from Orion ever since. The incident was logged as unexplained radio anomaly, with all audio recordings attached. No official explanation was ever offered. No equipment fault was ever found. The sea keeps its secrets, but sometimes it sends them back, echoing across the airwaves. The silence on that channel now feels heavier, always waiting. I've been a wharf carpenter for 27 years, working these docks and coastal structures from Port Angeles down to Grays Harbor. You learn the language of the sea in that time. The groan of pilings under tide, the slap of water against the hull of a moored vessel, the cry of gulls, the distant thrum of an outbound freighter. My hands know the grain of creosote-treated timber, the bite of salt rust on a bolt, the weight of a pile driver's hammer. This stretch of coast, specifically, has its own unique soundtrack, and one of the most constant notes is the bell buoy at the outer channel mark. Most mornings started the same. I was on the slip rail, replacing a section of worn decking. The old timbers were soft, rotted through in places from years of saltwater spray and heavy gear rolling over them. The air was cool, carrying the sharp tang of brine and the sweeter, resinous scent of fresh-cut Douglas fir. I'd spent the early hours in the tool shed, cutting and shaping the new planks, the rhythmic whine of the circular saw, a counterpoint to the distant harbor noises. Inside that shed, the air hung heavy with the smell of sawdust and old oil. Ropes hung from pegs, coils of mooring line and utility cord, swaying slightly with the drafts that snaked through the gaps in the corrugated metal walls. The bell buoy, approximately 2 nautical miles offshore, was a constant, almost subconscious presence. Its sound is a critical part of navigation, a sonic landmark. The bell rings when waves lift and drop the buoy, causing the internal clapper to strike. So, the cadence of its ringing is a direct readout of the sea state. Consistent wind and chop mean a consistent, predictable ring. Any deviation, any change in that rhythm, signals a shift in the water, or a problem with the buoy itself. For me, it was a fundamental rule. The buoy tells the truth about the water. That morning, the wind was coming steady out of the north-northwest, a light breeze, maybe 10 knots. The chop was equally consistent. Small, regular waves. Nothing significant. It was the kind of day that should produce a gentle, almost lazy and slightly irregular clang from the buoy. But as I worked in the shed, the sound cutting through the drone of the saw, I noticed something off. The bell was ringing with an unnerving precision. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike was distinct, evenly spaced, almost mechanical. It was too regular for the observed sea state, too forceful for the light chop. It sounded like a metronome, but one beating to a rhythm that didn't match the visible conditions. I stopped the saw, listening intently. My first thought was fatigue. I'd been up since before dawn. The work was physical, and sometimes the brain plays tricks. I chalked it up to an illusion of sound, a trick of the wind carrying the noise. I glanced at the windsock on the mainmast of the harbor master's office, still pointing north-northwest. A steady, unwavering flag. I looked out at the water, which showed nothing but the expected, small, regular waves. The discrepancy nagged at me, but I dismissed it, picking up my saw again. The smell of fresh-cut cedar, lingering from a previous job in the corner of the shed, mixed strangely with the creosote on my hands. But the rhythm persisted. It wasn't fading or changing. It was relentless, precise. After another hour, the insistent, out-of-phase ringing became impossible to ignore. It was no longer a subtle anomaly. It was a dominant, unnerving pulse. I walked out of the shed onto the main dock, then further along the slip rail, trying to get a clearer line of sight to the outer mark. The buoy was visible, a dark dot against the gray-green water. I watched it, expecting to see it pitching wildly, or perhaps a rogue wave that would explain the powerful, even strikes. But it was just bobbing, gently, with the same. The buoy wasn't moving enough to generate that kind of consistent, forceful clang. It was as if something else was ringing it. Back in the tool shed, retrieving a pry bar, I noticed something else. The ropes hanging from the pegs, the coils of utility cord, were swaying. Not much, just a subtle, almost imperceptible oscillation. But they were moving. And they were moving in time with the buoy's unnatural cadence. Clang, sway, clang, sway. It wasn't the wind. The shed was mostly sheltered. It was a vibration, a low-frequency resonance, a standing wave cadence, somehow traveling through the very structure of the wharf, through the ground, into the shed. It was a beat felt more than seen. My professional protocol is clear. Any suspected malfunction of a navigation aid must be reported immediately. I reached for the VHF radio, flipped it on, and tried to raise the harbor master. Static. Just a hiss of white noise. I tried again, checking the antenna, the power. Nothing. I pulled out my personal cell phone. No signal. This was highly unusual. The docks usually had decent coverage. It felt like a deliberate silence, an isolation. The ringing continued, a constant, impossible heartbeat. Waiting for comms to clear felt wrong, irresponsible. The buoy was ringing, and it wasn't telling the truth about the water. I decided to take the work skiff out to the outer mark myself for a visual inspection. It was a short run, and I knew these waters like the back of my hand. I fired up the skiff's outboard and headed out. The water was calm, exactly as I'd observed from the dock. The wind was still light. As I approached the buoy, the ringing grew louder, more insistent, filling the small boat. It was the same precise, off-kilter rhythm. I cut the engine and drifted closer, letting the skiff bump gently against the buoy's hull. The bell was ringing, right next to me, loud and clear. The buoy itself was perfectly upright, bobbing gently, almost imperceptibly, with the normal small chop. There was no visible mechanism forcing the bell to ring. No debris caught on its structure, no rogue waves, nothing to explain the powerful, even strikes. I reached out and put my hand on the buoy's painted metal skin. It vibrated, a deep, resonant hum, pulsing through the metal, up my arm, into the hull of the skiff. The vibration matched the bell's cadence exactly. I leaned over the side, looking down into the water around the buoy.
The surface chop was normal, small, unremarkable. But beneath it, just at the edge of my perception, I felt it. A subtle, deep, rhythmic surge. An invisible pulse in the water itself. A slow, powerful oscillation that matched the bell's cadence, resonating the buoy from below. It was a standing wave, but one that shouldn't exist in these conditions. Generated by an unknown, unseen force. A pulse in the very fabric of the sea. I remembered a calm summer day, years ago, fishing with my father from this very spot. The water glassy and still. The only sound the distant gulls and the gentle lapping against the hull. The contrast with this unnatural resonance was stark. Chilling. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't explain it. The source of that deep, rhythmic pulse in the water remained invisible, beyond my understanding. I started the engine, leaving the buoy to its relentless, impossible ringing. Back at the dock, the radio still crackled with static. My phone remained without signal. And in the tool shed, the ropes still swayed, subtly, in time with the distant, precise, off-kilter beat. The bell buoy continued to ring its impossible rhythm. A constant, low thrum felt more than heard, resonating through the very structure of the wharf. A clock, counting out a time that didn't exist. I logged the incident in the harbor master's book, noted the entry remains open. The sound is still there. I've been an inventory clerk for going on 15 years now, mostly working the docks along the mid-Atlantic coast. You learn the rhythm of the place. The groan of the gantry cranes at dawn, the smell of brine and diesel fuel, the way the fog rolls in thick from the bay and then burns off by mid-morning. My job is simple, in theory. Track what comes in, what goes out, and what sits in limbo. I use a ruggedized tablet, a handheld scanner, and a good old-fashioned clipboard for backup. Accuracy is everything. A misplaced crate, a miscounted pallet. That's money, time, and sometimes a whole lot of trouble. Every item, from a small package to a full container, has a unique identifier, a manifest entry, and a physical location. My day typically starts before the sun clears the horizon, checking the overnight manifests against the physical reality on the dock apron. I'll walk the rows of stacked containers, the smaller crates under tarps, scanning, cross-referencing, verifying. It's a methodical process. My primary tool is the industrial tablet, equipped with our proprietary inventory management system. Every action, a check, a move, a return, requires a digital sign-off. For higher security items or any final disposition, the system requires a stylus signature, which it records using a pressure trace script. This script isn't just a digital image. It captures the unique pressure points, the speed, the minute hesitations specific to an authorized user's hand. It's our gold standard for authentication. No two traces are identical, and it's meant to be unforgeable. Yesterday evening, the system showed a low volume of outbound freight, mostly smaller, high-value items being prepped for air cargo. My shift ended at 1800, and I logged out, heading home for a quiet evening. This morning, pulling up the overnight log from the log bench in the office, I started my routine check.
The system flagged one item, crate 733 Delta, as having been checked and returned at 2017 yesterday. My first thought was a system error, or perhaps a misplaced decimal in the timestamp. A quick mental check of the manifest from the previous day told me crate 733 Delta was a specialized piece of industrial testing equipment, awaiting pickup by a specific carrier. It had been sitting in the overflow section, under a heavy reinforced tarp, for 3 days. I grabbed my tablet and headed back out to the dock apron. The morning air was sharp, carrying the metallic tang of the harbor mixed with diesel and wet salt. It felt particularly distinct that morning, almost abrasive. I navigated past stacks of empty pallets and a hulking gantry crane that loomed silent against the pale sky. The overflow section was tucked away, behind a row of outbound containers. Sure enough, there it was. Crate 733 Delta. Exactly where it had been for the past 3 days, still under its grimy green tarp. The tarp was secured with heavy-duty straps, exactly as I'd left it. No signs of disturbance. This was a problem. The system showed it as returned, meaning it was no longer physically present on our property, but it clearly was. My initial thought was that I had misread the manifest. Perhaps it was crate 733 Gamma or some other similar identifier. A minor mistake, easily made when you're tired. I pulled back a corner of the tarp, careful not to disturb the straps. The stenciled serial number on the crate itself matched. 733 Delta. The carrier's specific pickup tag was still affixed, untouched. I tried to flag the discrepancy on my tablet. The system rejected the action. Item 733 Delta is not currently in inventory. Status: returned. It wouldn't let me mark it as present, because according to its records, it wasn't. The protocol for this situation is usually straightforward. Verify, report, and if necessary, manually override. Frustrated, I went to the audit log for 733 Delta. The entry for checked and returned at 2017 was there, bold and definitive. I tapped to view the associated signature. My breath hitched. The pressure trace script displayed on the screen was unmistakably mine. The familiar loops, the slight upward flick at the end of the last stroke, the characteristic pressure points. It was a perfect match for my authenticated signature profile, but I wasn't here at 2017 yesterday. I was at home, watching a documentary about deep-sea exploration. I even remembered a specific scene, a bioluminescent jellyfish, because it reminded me of the time I'd seen a school of mackerel flashing in the shallows near the old fishing pier as a kid. That simple, mundane memory felt impossibly distant and comforting compared to what I was seeing now. I went back to the log bench, pulling up my personal login history. At 2017 yesterday, my access code was logged out. It had been logged out since 1802. I requested the supervisor pull the security footage for the dock apron, specifically the area around crate 733 Delta, from 2000 to 2030. We watched the playback together. The supervisor sat beside me, his brow furrowed. The footage showed nothing. The dock apron was empty, save for the static stacks of freight. No vehicles, no forklifts, no personnel. The tarp over crate 733 Delta remained undisturbed. The timestamp on the footage advanced, second by agonizing second, past 2017. Nothing moved. Nothing happened. Yet, the system had recorded a physical action, a check, a return, authenticated by my unique digital signature. "It's a glitch," the supervisor finally said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Has to be, a system ghost." But the pressure trace script wasn't a ghost. It was a digital fingerprint. Irrefutable proof that someone had signed off using my unique identifier, with the exact physical characteristics of my hand, at a time when I was miles away and the dock was empty. The system was asserting that I had been here, that I had physically handled crate 733 Delta, and that it was now gone. The crate is still under its tarp, exactly where it was. It's physically present, a solid, undeniable mass. But the inventory system, the very foundation of our operations, insists it isn't. I can't log it back in because it's not missing. I can't log it out because it's already returned. The log entry, with my impossible signature, remains. The system has signed out a crate that is still here, and I don't know what to do about it. I've been the night watch lead at this marina for 15 years. Before that, I spent a decade on commercial fishing vessels up and down the Pacific coast. I know water. I know what it does, how it moves, what makes it angry. My shifts run from 2000 to 0400, mostly quiet, methodical work. It's about vigilance, not drama. My gear is standard issue. Heavy-duty flashlight, handheld radio, a logbook, a set of keys, and the ever-present smell of salt and diesel on my jacket. The marina is tucked deep in a bay, well protected from the open ocean. We rarely see anything more than a gentle swell, even in a stiff gale. A typical night begins with a full perimeter check. I walk the docks, inspecting lines, ensuring fenders are properly placed, checking bilge pumps, and verifying security gates are latched. The North Slip, where this began, is particularly calm. It's a narrow finger of water, shielded on 3 sides by bulkheads and on the 4th by a sturdy breakwater. The water here usually just laps, a soft rhythmic sound against the pilings. We have a tide pole at the end of the North Slip, painted with clear foot and inch markers, which I check every 2 hours to log the actual water level against the predicted tide charts. It's a redundant measure, but that's the nature of maritime safety. The core protocol is simple. Observe, log, report. Every anomaly, every loose line, every unexpected sound gets noted. We rely on predictability. Tides are charted years in advance. Weather systems are tracked with satellite precision. Even rogue waves have known, if rare, causes. Seismic activity, extreme weather fronts, or distant underwater landslides. My job is to maintain vessel security and safety based on these predictable parameters. Anything outside that framework is, by definition, an emergency. It was 01:37 hours. The wind gauge at the office had been holding steady at 3 knots from the northeast for hours, barely a breath. The sky was clear, studded with stars, and the air was crisp, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I was halfway down the North Slip, checking the stern lines of a 48-foot trawler, when the water moved. It wasn't a ripple or a gentle undulation. It was a single, deep heave. The calm slip rolled once like a chest breath, a sudden, powerful surge that walked the trawler's stern inboard with an audible groan of stretched nylon. I froze, flashlight beam sweeping the water. The trawler, which had been resting gently against its fenders, now scraped hard against the pilings. Fender marks, dark rubber streaks, rose on the wooden rail. then fell back silent as the water settled. The whole event lasted maybe 5 seconds. I checked my watch, then clicked on the radio. Night watch to office. Did we just have a seismic event? Over. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, calm and unhurried. Negative, night watch. No alerts. All clear. Over. I walked quickly to the tide pole. The water was already back to its charted level. 5.2 feet, exactly as predicted. But I knew what I'd seen. The water had risen, briefly and sharply, by at least a foot, maybe more. My log entry was terse. 0137. Unexplained surge, north slip. Trawler Sea Serpent stern moved 18 inches inboard. Fender marks present. Wind, 3 kts northeast. No seismic activity reported. I made a mental note to check the trawler's stern lines for chafing on my next round. I'd seen wakes from passing tugs cause similar movements, but not in this protected slip, and certainly not with zero external cause. I attributed it, initially, to some rare, localized pressure wave, maybe even a distant, unrecorded seismic tremor that barely registered. It was a small concession to the inexplicable, a way to rationalize what I'd just witnessed without abandoning the rules. On my 0200 round, I was back at the north slip. The Sea Serpent was still resting against the pilings, the fender marks stark. I noticed the distinct, almost sweet smell of creosote from the pilings, stronger now, as if the wood had been freshly disturbed. I inspected the stern lines. The port stern line, a 3/4-inch nylon braid, showed a clean, fresh chafe mark where it had rubbed against the edge of the stern cleat. It was deep, almost halfway through the strand. This wasn't just a gentle nudge, this was force. My protocol for line chafe is clear: replace immediately. But replacing a line at 0200 without a clear cause felt premature. The surge had been a one-off, hadn't it? I decided to just log the damage and recommend replacement in the morning. A small lapse in immediate action, a deferral born of the odd circumstances. At 0315, it happened again. I was at the fuel dock, a quarter-mile south, when my radio squawked. It was the security camera system, programmed to alert if a vessel moved more than 6 inches from its logged position. The alert specified the Sea Serpent in the north slip. I sprinted, my heavy boots thudding on the wet planks. When I arrived, the scene was eerily similar, but worse. The trawler's stern was again pressed hard against the pilings. This time, the starboard stern line had snapped cleanly, the frayed ends hanging limp. The port stern line, the one I'd noted for chafe, was now stretched taut, humming faintly, groaning against the cleat. The fender marks were higher this time, reaching a point on the railing that seemed impossible for the prevailing tide. The water, once again, was perfectly still, reflecting the distant dock lights like polished obsidian. I looked at the tide pole, 5.2 feet, unchanged. But the vessel had moved, significantly. My mind raced. How could a vessel move so violently without a corresponding change in water level? The only way was a sudden, localized pulse of water. A surge so brief and powerful it registered as a movement, not a sustained rise. It was like the water itself had taken a single, massive step. I remembered a summer afternoon, fishing with my father in a small skiff. The water so still you could see the bottom 10 feet down. The only movement, the gentle dip of our lines. This was the antithesis of that peace. My protocol for vessel damage due to weather or collision was well established. But this wasn't weather. and there was no collision. There was just water. I pulled out my logbook. 0315. Security alert, North Slip. Sea Serpent stern moved inboard again. Starboard stern line snapped. Port stern line severely stressed. Fender marks observed higher than previous incident. Tide pole reads 5.2 feet, no change. I radioed dispatch. Night watch to office. Urgent. Need immediate assistance at the North Slip. Significant vessel damage. Over. What's the situation, Night Watch? The dispatcher asked, her voice now edged with concern. Unexplained surge. 2 incidents. Line snapped. No visible cause. Over. There was a pause. No visible cause? Night Watch, confirm wind and tide readings. Over. Wind 3 knots, tide 5.2 feet. Confirmed. Over. Another pause, longer this time. Understood, Night Watch. Contacting supervisor. Stand by. Over. I stood there, the snapped line dangling, the trawler groaning in the silence. The water in the slip was flat, still, reflecting the stars. But I knew what it had done. It had moved with a force that defied every rule I knew, a single pulse that had walked the stern inboard, leaving behind only broken lines and impossible marks. The supervisor arrived 20 minutes later, his face grim. He looked at the snapped line, then at the tide pole, then back at me. He had no explanation either. The incident was logged as unexplained environmental damage. The Sea Serpent eventually required extensive hull inspection. No external impact was ever found.